Thank you all for coming to tonight. Now tonight's salon, Who's Afraid of Inequality? This is something of a rematch. Manchester Salon had a similar discussion about 2 months ago with Danny and Daniel, and at the end I asked them if they'd be willing to clash again at the Leeds Salon. But to mix it up a bit, I said that I would invite a third person onto the panel, and importantly that third person will probably be more from the side of the argument of Danny than Daniel, to reflect really the general opinion and the kind of consensus on this topic. Now, the issue of inequality seems to have risen up the political agenda in recent years, most famously, of course, at the spirit level, which I'm sure everybody will know, to become what some have characterised a theory of everything. Inequality is thought to be the cause of our current economic crisis, to lead to social breakdown and make us mentally ill. The solution is, of course, greater income equality, primarily in reining in the rich, but also in moving away from a concentration on economic growth itself towards a concentration on happiness and well-being. But amongst the many things we're kind of asking in the blurb is inequality a symptom or a cause of our current problems, and does the desire to make society a bit less unequal threaten to undermine both individual freedom and even the principle of equality itself as originally defined by the Enlightenment, which of course, due to our name, the Salon, we're very attached to. Now, to discuss these issues tonight, we have Daniel Ben-Ami, who is a financial journalist, editor of Fund Strategy and author of Cowardly Capitalism, and more recently Ferraris for All in Defence of Economic Progress, which Daniel discussed at the Salon a couple of years ago. Speaking next will be Danny Dorling, who is the Professor of Human Geography at the University of Sheffield and the author of many, many books, including, amongst his most recent ones, Injustice, Why Social Inequalities Persist, Fair Play, and The No-Nonsense Guide to Equality. And speaking last will be Martin O'Neill, who is lecturer in moral and political philosophy at the University of York. He is co-editor of Property Owning Democracy, Rules and Beyond, and author of The Facts of Inequality in the Journal of Moral Philosophy. Each of our speakers will have around 8 minutes to put their opening remarks across. If they don't overrun, I might ask them each to come back on one point that one other speaker has made before we go out to the audience. And if we don't have time to do that, they'll have to use the time when we come back to the panel to take each other's ideas up. So, starting with Daniel. Daniel Ben-Ami, yeah.
Okay, just to update something Paul said, I'm no longer editor of a specialist financial magazine, which I used to be. I'm now a freelance journalist. So I think some people classify me as part of the precariat, which means I have a precarious existence trying to earn a living as a freelance journalist. So if any of you want to offer me work out there, then I'll be glad to talk to you afterwards. What I think we need to debate this evening is how we understand equality. That's really important to bear in mind. It's not the existence of equality or inequality, but how we understand it. Because I'm pretty sure that everyone on the panel, and probably most, if not all of you, would agree that we live in a very unequal society. I think that's very clear. You just need to walk around Leeds or London or wherever and you can see that very clearly. I think pretty much everyone would agree that if you come from a rich background, then your life chances are probably better than if you come from a poor background. There's not really a debate about that. So if you go to Eton, for the sake of argument, or Westminster or some other posh school, then your life chances are probably better than if you go to a local comprehensive in Leeds or London or wherever. So I don't think we should debate those things. What we need to debate is how we understand equality and inequality. And that can bring out some really fundamental differences. I hope that's what we're going to be discussing this evening. And for the purposes of this discussion, I wanted to distinguish between two views. My view, which if I had to sum up in one word, I would say is about potential. It's about realising the full potential of individuals, which I would say is fundamentally about people themselves realising their full potential and giving them the capacity to achieve that. And The other view, which broadly speaking I think Danny and Martin probably hold, but they put forward their own arguments, which if you had to sum it up in one word is about harm. It's really about how inequality does harm to people in society. And I would argue that the view related to potential is very much in the tradition of the Enlightenment that Paul mentioned of the late 17th and 18th century. It's very much linked to concepts of freedom, of autonomy, of progress. It sees equality and the struggle for equality as part of a package, not just in and of itself. It's part of a package of realising the full human potential. The view which focuses on harm, which I won't speak about very much in this discussion, but just to say I think it's fundamentally a technocratic and elitist view. So it calls itself egalitarian, and in a sense it is egalitarian, but it's also elitist because it's really about getting the authorities to come in and heal society and deal with the disruptive consequences of inequality. So for reasons I'll spell out hopefully more in the discussion, I think it's quite authoritarian and elitist, and an argument I very much want to argue against. I haven't got much time, so maybe just to give you a bit more flesh on the bones of what I've talked about in relation to potential, seeing equality, realising full equality in terms of potential and relating it to the Enlightenment. I've got a quote here from the American Declaration of Independence, which was made in 1776 when America booted Britain out of the country, became an independent state. And this was their declaration. It's worth reading and then listening to, thinking about in more detail. So here we go. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now it's worth thinking about that, because I don't think you have to literally go along with every word of it. So for example, it talks about their Creator. I mean, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God or a creator or anything like that. But it's interesting how it locates equality in relation to this broader package that I spoke about. So it talks about unalienable rights, so it's talking about freedom. And then it goes on to talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, you don't need to accept the precise formulation, should we really be talking about the pursuit of happiness? What do we mean by it? There's all sorts of debates you can have in relation to that. The important thing I'm trying to get at here is that for Enlightenment thinkers, and this is an important Enlightenment document, they didn't just talk about equality in and of itself. They certainly thought equality was important. They just got Britain out of their country. They wanted to get rid of what was a kind of old colonial aristocratic form of rule that they'd suffered. They'd been a colony of Britain. But they very much linked it to liberty, to freedom in particular, and to social progress more generally. That very much is the Enlightenment conception of equality. Or maybe if I've got time to take another example, the Gettysburg Address. You've probably seen the Abraham Lincoln, the Lincoln film recently. This is 1863, Abraham Lincoln. I think I've got all the best lines in this discussion. I've stolen them from other people, but here you go. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So again, equality is very central to what he's arguing. He was in the middle of a war where ultimately the slaves were freed in America, but very much linking equality as a very important social goal to liberty. Seeing freedom and equality not as being counterposed to each other, and a lot of people do counterpose them. They say you have to have more, if you have more of one, then you have to have less of the other. That is not going along with this. This is saying that freedom and equality go together, and they're really very much wrapped up together in a conception of social progress. And that notion of equality today, I think we should very, very much uphold. That is a really positive notion that should definitely be upheld and pursued very much today. Do you have much more time?
A minute.
A minute. I think I'll just leave it there. I'll have an opportunity to criticise what the others have to say later on, hopefully. But really, just to bear in mind that I'm in favour of equality, pursuing equality, but in relation to the struggle for human potential, not as a top-down initiative by the authorities to try and keep us all in line and to get us to conform to the way they think society should be run.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's great to follow on from that, not least because in the no-nonsense guide to equality, which I did for the New Internationalist, the longest quote I have is from the American Declaration of Independence, because it is a very interesting document, and in fact they cut it down, the quote I put in, because the full declaration is worth reading if you're English, because after the bit that everybody quotes, there is then point after point after point about how terrible the English are. That is worth, and inequality can galvanise people to do something about their situation, and in a sense that's what the Americans did, and they created a much freer, much more open society that allowed people to work hard and exploit their potential, and worked extremely well when the farmers moved across the Americas, at least worked extremely well for the people who'd come from Europe, not so much for the people who were already there. And it worked so well that you could measure how well it worked in terms of what happened to Americans. Americans around about, I think it's 1850, were the tallest people on earth. They were the fittest people on earth. This was a highly successful, very egalitarian society. Americans are no longer the tallest people on earth. The tallest people on earth now are actually the Dutch on average. People look at various parts of Africa in small groups to try and find a taller group, but it's the Dutch. The Dutch are absolutely enormous now. And I would argue that part of the reason why the Dutch have managed to become so tall is because they've had a much more equal society. And because they've had a much more equal society than the one that America has become and we've become, that allows all people in Holland to have a greater chance of actually reaching their potentials. Not just their potential height, but their potentials in whatever else they can do. I don't happen to believe that our potentials are necessarily fixed, that there are limits to them, that you can tell that a child can reach a certain point and not any further. But I think you have to try to arrange things so that people really can shine and can do better in the circumstances that they get. We do vary. We are very different in very many ways. It would be extremely boring if we didn't vary very much, but we do vary. But there's one problem with the way in which we vary, and that is that some of us are a bit greedier than others. Some people do like holding on to money or trying to get it a bit more than other people. Quite a lot of people want to live a happy life, want to be useful to their family or their communities, and are not so interested in making a lot of money and holding on to a lot of money. For millennia, we have organised ways in societies to control people who are more greedy than usual, because you get a problem when greedy people take more and more of what there is. To put it far too simplistically, I'd say our current problem in Britain is that our mechanisms for controlling the greedy have broken down, and we need to reinsert them again. If you look across the rich world, those rich world countries that do best in all kinds of ways are the ones that have managed to keep their control on greed working better than those ones which are working less well. And you can see it in things like life expectancy and rates of mental illness and so on. It's a constant struggle to control people who are obsessed by getting more and more money. There will always be these people. There may even be points in all of our lives when we're greedier than at other times, but we need to control that greed because it reduces other people's freedoms, other people's ability to do things, if some people have a disproportionate number of tickets. And in a sense, that's what money is. Money is a ticket that allows you to do certain things, allows you to travel, allows you to live in certain places. And when it becomes very unevenly distributed, the potential and the freedoms of the majority of society are curtailed, and very strange things happen. So I'll give you a few examples of the strange things that occur. As your income inequalities increase, say in Britain, where we now know that if you're in the top 10th of society, you're very likely to get paid a lot more for whatever job you do than if you're in the bottom 10th of society. it becomes more and more important, for instance, to go to university. It then becomes possible to charge students £9,000 a year to go to university, and they and their parents are willing to put themselves into debt to pay for this because they see it as a way of guaranteeing their future earnings. When there was much less difference between incomes of different occupations, you couldn't do this. You couldn't say we're going to charge you £9,000 a year for this and expect people to actually pay it. In most rich countries of the world, where there aren't as big differences between salaries, you don't get away with doing this either. Other examples where potentials and freedom are reduced by inequality. When we had a much more even income structure in this country in the 1950s, 60s and 1970s, at least for the start of that period, we had near full employment. We weren't actually paying any more out in salaries and in wages in total. We were just paying it out a bit more evenly. That allows people to express their potentials, because when young people can get jobs, if you can't get a job, how do you express your potential? And if the reason you can't get a job is because more and more the salary bill is going to people at the top, then no matter how hard you try, unless you overthrow your elders in some way, you aren't going to be able to show all the kind of potential you have. So we have an incredibly well-educated young population who are incredibly poorly employed at the moment. The biggest problem with employment that's gone on in Britain is people simply not being hired anymore. I'll give you another couple of examples if I can. I don't want to go over. So
You've got about 2 to 3 minutes.
2 to 3 minutes, great. Okay. One of my favourite examples is housing. What happens with housing and the freedom to be able to live where you want to live when the society becomes more unequal? We actually have more rooms in our houses per person than we've ever had in Britain. We've never had as much housing as we have now. People will often tell you that we need to build more, and I'm not against building more, but we actually already have more than we've ever had. It's just that we're sharing it out more unequally than we've ever had. In inner London, there are more bedrooms than there are people. It's just quite a lot of those bedrooms are empty, but they're in houses that people with lots and lots of money own. The population in Kensington has gone down in the last 10 years. There aren't fewer bedrooms in Kensington, there are just more empty bedrooms. All of that has the effect of making it harder and harder for people to be able to choose where they want to be able to live. So people are having to live in places that are further away from where they work. If you look at a much more equal country, my favourite example with housing is Japan, and you talk to people in Japan about how they chose where they live in the city in which they live, they often say to me when I ask them, they live there because they happen to like the park over there, or they live there because they knew somebody from another area, because the house prices do not vary that dramatically across the city. And on different streets there are cheaper houses and more expensive houses. You don't have the kind of segregation that we have, which has grown up in terms of Britain. And you also don't get the situation where, at least for younger people, they're spending up to half of their income on housing. And that's not paying for the cost of having built it. It's paying for the value of the land and the housing, which is all about how far away are you from other people who are poorer. That's what determines house prices. So a more unequal country becomes a country where your freedom to choose where you live is reduced, and that reduces what you can do. And lastly, health. If you want people to be able to express themselves as much as they can and to do a very good job with their lives, you need them to be able to be healthy. You need to be able to provide them with a health service which will keep them healthy when they're sick. You can't make the best of your life when you're ill and nobody helps treat you for being ill. In a more unequal country, people become sicker more often, and simple things go wrong. One example of this is it becomes harder and harder to persuade doctors, who tend to be very well paid, to live or work anywhere near people who are ill. The result of this is that you end up having a lack of doctors in the areas with the worst ill health. So more people become ill in those areas, there's less treatment for those people who need it. You end up with more doctors working in private practice, doing cosmetic things to people that don't really need to be done, but they have the money to pay for it. And the potential for people across society is reduced, and your freedom to do things is reduced, because you can't cure yourself. You can't be your own doctors. You're part of the society. and you need your society to work well to let yourself work well. Most countries in the rich world are much more equal than we are. We do badly, I would say, largely because of our levels of income and wealth inequality, and these are currently rising, even though we have some of the highest levels in Western Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Martin?
So I'm very glad that Danny mentioned the Dutch. So Holland's a much more egalitarian society than this one, and one of the ways that you can see that that's led to certain kinds of flourishing is the height of the Dutch. I was once at Schiphol Airport where I'd been to a conference and suddenly had to go to Ireland for a family funeral and didn't have a suit. So I went into the one suit shop in Schiphol Airport, and the man looked at me very gravely and he said, "In Holland we are very tall. We will not have much clothes that would fit you." So that for me was a very striking example of the fact that that was, in some way at least, a flourishing and egalitarian society. So I'm delighted with how Daniel set up the debate, because I think it makes things dreadfully clear to say, on the one hand, one might take the view that what we should care about is providing the social conditions where individuals can realise their potential, where you have real opportunities for people, and where you can have human flourishing. Or on the other hand, we might take a perspective that's kind of bureaucratic, centralising, that has a kind of top-down mindset that cares only about some sort of Grindian idea of individual kind of harm or utility, and that didn't take people seriously as agents. And I think if people like me, who are in favour of a much more egalitarian society, if people like me who think that there should be much less inequality in income and wealth, really did have that latter view, if what we just were after was some sort of top-down bureaucratic society where we were making sure that everyone had exactly the same level of utility, then our view would be very hard to defend. But I don't think for a moment that that's the view that people who hold an egalitarian view do defend. And I think one can argue very strongly for having a much more egalitarian society in terms of income and wealth, if what one cares about is opportunity, if what one cares about is individual potential. Now, I was kind of reading through some of the some sort of great egalitarian theorists in preparation for this, and I was interested. Daniel thought he might have the best quote, so he could wheel on Lincoln and the Declaration of Independence. Well, I've got a radical egalitarian who said this about Britain. This egalitarian theorist said, "More than almost any developed nation, ours is a country in which your parentage dictates your progress," right? Which means that your potential is kept down, that it's things outside your control, like your parentage, that determine how your life goes. Those who are born poor are more likely to stay poor, and those who inherit privilege are more likely to pass on privilege in England than in any comparable country. This is the worst developed country for social mobility. It's worse than the US, it's worse than our European neighbours. For those of us who believe in social justice, says this radical figure, this stratification and segregation are morally indefensible. Can anyone guess the name of that famous egalitarian theorist? It's Michael Gove.
Yeah.
Michael Gove, speaking about inequality. Another radical egalitarian said, "Our society is still too closed and too static. A society that still says where you were born and who you were born to matters for the rest of your life, where working hard and doing the right thing does not guarantee you a better future, where children of poor people are more likely to be illiterate, more likely to be unhappy, more likely to die young." Well, that was Nick Clegg, another sort of radical egalitarian firebrand. Now, in the speech where Clegg said that, he said something of this form. He said, if we could cure these problems with crushed potential just by using the tax system, just by creating a more egalitarian society, then of course we'd do that. But that solution won't work. That solution doesn't deliver what we want, and therefore that's not something that we're going to aim at. The problem is that that's simply untrue. If one looks at correlations between socioeconomic inequality and levels of social mobility, then the more inequality there is in society, the more calcified it is, the harder it is to move between different positions. No doubt there's all sorts of mechanisms for that. The more inegalitarian a society you have, the more that people at the top with huge amounts of money spend on advancing the interests of their own kids and their own family. But what we see is that more egalitarian societies have more social mobility. And so if what we care about is having conditions under which we can have the realisation of individual potential, we've got very good reason, although Nick Clegg doesn't think so, but the empirical research would seem to suggest that he's wrong on this. We've got very good reason to favour a society that has a more egalitarian distribution of income and wealth, because the more unequal we are, the less chance we have for our potential to come out. Daniel talked as well about worries about conformity, so in Daniel's bureaucratic nightmare of top-down egalitarianism, you crush the individual spirits of individual citizens. You don't allow them to express themselves. I think it's right that we should be worried about conformity. We should be worried about people whose spirits are crushed and who don't get the chance to express themselves as active agents authoring their own lives. But I think if that's what we care about, then actually it's people who are poor that don't get the chance to express themselves. It's people who are having to work all the hours that God sends for terrible wages, and who are terrified of losing their job, and who have to just put up with working in a call centre and having timed bathroom breaks and not having any time to themselves or to think, reading off scripts and doing exactly what the boss says, lest you anger this person on whom you depend. When my sort of uncles and aunts and parents came over to Britain from Ireland in the 1960s during a period of full employment, as Danny was saying, one thing they always talk about was if you didn't like a job, if you didn't get on with your boss, you walked out of it and you went to a new job the next day. So there was a kind of freedom there was a kind of agency that meant that they had to be treated with respect by their employers. And that doesn't exist now. If you're someone terrified of unemployment, if you're looking extreme poverty in the face, and you're under the influence, subject to the will of outside forces that are going to restrict your chance to kind of develop your potential, or to avoid having to be a conformist who just does what they have to be told. How am I for?
You've got 1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, so I think if we care about equality of opportunity, given that equality of opportunity is only possible, given that decent levels of equality of opportunity are only possible in less unequal societies than this one, that gives us a good reason, without thinking that we need some sort of technocratic top-down idea of equality, it gives us good reason to want a more socio-economically egalitarian society. And where we don't do that, it's just, we have a society where we can't justify the economic structure of the society to people that have to live under it. Not just because they're being harmed by it, but because their potential can't be realised, and because they're crushed by it, and they can't develop and express their own agency. It's also an extraordinary waste of potential. If you think about the narrow background of people that end up as CEOs of companies, or end up as cabinet ministers, or even members of parliament, the fact that we're only really, collectively, we're only using the ability of a tiny, tiny proportion of our society, and all of the potential of so many people that gets kind of wasted for a lack of opportunity to develop their potential. I'll just finish by going back to another of Daniel's quotes from Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln's great hope was for government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, what that might mean is that you have a common democratic life, a common idea of democratic citizenship, where everyone, no matter who they are, can hope to hold political office or influence political outcomes. I think we'd all agree, right, whatever we think about a kind of purely distributive idea of equality, we'd all think that living in a democratic society where we have a shared democratic life and where everyone might get the chance to actually influence democratic processes is something that we should care about. Yet what do we see under conditions of significant inequality is that we just don't get that. We've got a them and us society where there's very little understanding even between people at the top and bottom of the income distribution, and you've only to look at the composition not just of the current cabinet or the Prime Minister's advisory team staffed mostly by old Etonians, but look at the class background of Labour MPs at the moment. We're cutting off a vast number of our fellow citizens from having the kind of opportunity to engage in the kind of common political life that goes with government of, by and for the people that Lincoln might have hoped to have. So I'll stop there, but I think one can accept everything that Daniel says, but just think that the consequences of what he says points in rather a different direction to the direction that he might want to point it towards.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, before we go out to the audience, is there any point in particular you'd like to come back on now, Daniel?
Absolutely. Well, I was really interested in Martin's quotes from Gove and Clegg. If I can nick them from you afterwards, I'd appreciate that, because I think that reinforces my argument rather than detracts from it, because something really, really peculiar has happened in the discussion of equality, especially social equality.
It's difficult to hear at the back.
Okay, sorry. I'll just come up here, but I'll speak very briefly. Something very strange has happened to the discussion of social equality, because broadly speaking, it used to be the left that thought inequality was a problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Carriage Works. Upstairs at the Carriage Works is now open for this evening's performance of the Count of Monte Cristo. May I take this opportunity to remind you that the cameras and flash photography is strictly prohibited. Upstairs at the Carriage Works is now open. Thank you.
Okay, so broadly speaking, it was the left that said inequality is a problem, and broadly speaking, conservatives would defend inequality. What's happened now is very peculiar, because a lot of very conservative people, including David Cameron, not only Michael Gove, but including David Cameron, are saying that inequality is a big problem. And this historically is a long way away from what conservatives used to argue. So that's one thing I'm drawing your attention to. Something peculiar is happening. There's also been a book called The Spirit Level, which the panelists know well, I'm sure most of you have heard of, which has very much been praised by Ed Miliband and David Cameron. So it's become completely mainstream. It used to be something radical. It's now become completely mainstream to say inequality is a problem. But what these people are saying, and I think Martin really played it down too much, I don't know about his own views in terms of what the mainstream argument is. What the Spirit Level does, for example, just summarising in a very few sentences, apart from its shoddy statistics, which I'm not going to go into right now, but people have missed the thrust of what it's saying, which is a problem, which is that they look at all of these societies and say, look, there's all these correlations, because in unequal societies, what you have is more crime, more violence, more teenage pregnancies, more ill health, and so on. And then what they're arguing, really, is that the authorities have to come in and to deal with this. The authorities have to, have these interventions where, or certainly this is implicit in what they're saying, why politicians like it so much. They have to stop the underclass misbehaving, drinking too much, practicing unsafe sex, all these crime problems. It's a therapeutic approach, and that what it's trying to do very much is getting the state to intervene, to get people to behave in what they consider to be a respectable kind of way. It's not about individuals realising their own potential. It's very much about the state and the technocrats telling people how to behave and trying to enforce those forms of behaviour. That might not be what Danny and Martin want, but I think that is very much the thrust of mainstream policy, and it very much follows from what's in the Spirit Level, which is why Miliband and Cameron like it so much.
Would you like to come back on any point in particular, reply to that, or come back on anything else that Daniel said?
I mean, just very, very quickly on the Spirit Level. I think one shouldn't take too seriously what David Cameron says about his attitude to that book. So I think it's interesting that he thought that he had to say that he thought that inequality was a terrible problem, because that at least shows that David Cameron thinks, quite rightly, that in the country at large, people do care about the excessive levels of inequality that we've got. But I think, I mean, in terms of the recommendations of the Spirit level, the most straightforward things that it would encourage a government to do would be simply to use the tax system to even out the post-tax distribution of income. And for David Cameron, on the one hand, to say, well, I'm very troubled by inequality, and I'm very interested in these arguments of Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, and I think we need to take it seriously. And then at the same time, to make changes to the tax system that give very large, let's say take the tax and benefit system, make changes to the tax and benefit system that deliver a bonanza of reduced taxation for those at the top, but leave through cuts in benefits, leave the worse off than they previously were. That goes exactly against just the most minimal thing that the Spirit level would have you do. So I think there's a big gap between what David Cameron says and what he does, and we should probably take more seriously what he does, because that might reveal what he actually thinks.
Okay. Danny?
Yeah, I would agree with you about state intervention in many ways. It's better to have a more equal society with less state intervention. So that's American society, which was pretty equal because people really did roll out and get their bit of land. The state intervention was allowing people to roll out and do that without the British taxing them. But by being more equal, they did better. One useful thing about us being so unequal is that there's a wide variety of more equal countries, and they have different forms of being more equal. It's not always because of state intervention. So, for instance, in Japan, they have very low rates of taxation. It's just that the salaries are very similar to begin with. Whereas in Scandinavia, they tax people highly to make the salaries more equal. I think it's far better if people are paid more equally in the first place. Then you don't think this is terrible, I'm having all the money taken off me. And you don't have to have a giant bureaucracy to do it, and you don't have the chance of losing it. But I'm slightly anarchistic on this. I would prefer a more equal society with less state intervention, but it's rather hard to get there. And it has to be said, the main way that the largest, most equal countries in the world became much more equal was by state intervention, but not their own states. Japan became equal because it lost a war to the United States, which then took land off the aristocracy in Japan. Germany became much more equal because it lost a war and had equality imposed upon it in terms of the Marshall Plan, and somebody put a great big wall halfway through Berlin. That's why Berlin is not like London now. So sadly, those countries which are more equal in the rich world have often become more equal because the people at the top of society had power taken away from them by another country. And one of the reasons why the United States and United Kingdom are so very, very unequal is because the people at the top haven't been disposed of for many, many, many generations. I'm not advocating that we should want to be invaded, but it is very hard. If you're trying to look at how did different countries come to get in the position they are, often it is a result of revolution or war that has ended up with one country being different to another. So moving countries between different positions of equality is difficult. And I would agree, having a state telling you all have to do this doesn't necessarily make for a happy situation. But without a state interfering in some way, great inequalities can rise up. You need a way to stop
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats in upstairs at the carriage as the performance will commence in 3 minutes. 3 minutes, thank you.
That's a good point to go out to the audience. I'm sorry about that. It did happen once before, years ago, and I forgot all about it because it's never happened again since, but it'll remind me for the next time. Right, questions and comments from the floor. As the regulars will know, we'll take several before we come back to the panel and let you have your say and try and create a real discussion within the room itself. So, Graham?
Thank you. I take entirely Martin's point that the rhetoric and the reality can be somewhat different. I remember on the Big Society website, Cameron had his quotes alongside those of Paulo Freire and Saul Alinsky. I thought that was a bit disingenuous. Nonetheless, I spent the morning with a lot of people concerned about the exponential rise of street homeless populations here in this city, and that would seem to be a visible representation of some of the things that we're talking about. But I want to talk about, for a moment, perhaps the elephant in the room, which is that we simply haven't got a system that has got any desire for equality. Perhaps we had a post-war consensus that believed in equality, but we soon moved to a situation in which we accepted a market-driven economy and all its equalities, which is precisely why we lost the political language of equality, and what we put in its place was equality of opportunity. And there's a massive distinction between talking about equality and talking about equality of opportunity. And thence we've had the narrative of social inclusion, all of which simply seeks to mitigate the negative effects of equality in the first place. So perhaps that takes us back to the final point, which is about the necessity of some political equality to create potentially the mechanisms for reconsidering, reimagining a society where we might indeed be interested in equality in the first place. Citizenship today, a political concept, seems to be entirely aligned with working. And if you're not working, you're not a citizen.
Okay. Anyone else? That's it. 1, 2, and 3.
How does equality square itself with the Darwinian model, particularly with respect to wealth creation and entrepreneurial spirit from which employment comes?
And over there.
Yeah, I just wondered how you would put it, that say that Holland is a much more equal society than our own. You said that Germany and Japan had equality imposed on them, whereas Holland didn't have that. They just thrived by themselves, and they are a very equal society. You could say it's because of the royal family in our the Queen and so on, and that imposes a class system. But the Dutch have got a royal family, and that, do they have such a class system in Holland? I don't know. Can you explain that for me?
Anybody else before we go back to the panel? That'll take 2 more, 1, then at the back.
Yeah. I'm just interested, Daniel, you talk about mechanisms for controlling greed that have broken down. I'm interested in perhaps what you think those mechanisms are, and whether competition legislation might fit within that overall category. In terms of looking back, historical mechanisms of upholding freedom seem to me fundamentally to include those competition laws and control competitive markets.
Okay, Kate?
I wanted to ask about people in the middle. So there was quite a lot of discussion about rich people and about poor people. And I just wanted to ask, do you see people in the middle as quite a large problem in the inequality debate? And if you do, what do you think should be done about that?
Okay, right. We've got a bit of equality of opportunity versus political equality. We've got Darwinian theory, we've got inverse care law, why is Holland more equal, competitive legislation, people in the middle. Who'd like to begin? What about Holland? Why is...
Okay, let's start with Holland. I mean, Holland has been invaded more recently, much more recently than we've been invaded, but I think Holland's a really good example to look at for a country because it's very similar to us. The thing we often don't remember about Holland is that currently the great world power is the United States. It might be declining, but it's a great world power. The world power before the United States was Great Britain, when half the world was coloured pink or red. The world power, the most powerful country in the world before Great Britain, was the United Provinces, and the world centred around Amsterdam. And in a sense, I think Holland shows you a possible future for Britain. You just need to get far enough away from when you were that rich and you forget about being great again. And that's part Holland isn't that different. there may be other advantages. It's a smaller country. I often think if you all speak the same language and nobody else speaks your language, it does help a bit. I know the officers of spirit level hate this argument about language. It doesn't just help defend you from really inane American advertising, because they have to dub it for it to work. But it also helps in one of the ways of controlling inequality. One may be controlling competition law and things like rent controls. But the other one, which certainly worked in this country in the past, in the 1920s and 30s and through for the post-war consensus, is installing a sense of shame about your own behaviour. And it may be that people in Holland know each other a bit better, so that if somebody is particularly greedy, there's a greater sense of embarrassment about that. Whereas in an English-speaking country, it's far easier to move around the world. So if, for instance, supposing that you're suddenly a great banker, making millions and millions, and then people no longer think of you as a great banker anymore, you can hop back to the United States and live there. You don't have to carry on living in shame in London anymore. But if you're a Dutch banker and you behave badly, you've got to go somewhere where nobody else speaks the language you grew up speaking and your children. And that may help. But the officers spirit level hate the language argument. But I do want...
Dutch banker, because you'd be speaking English.
Yeah.
What's that?
If you were a Dutch banker, you would be speaking English.
Or German or French.
Oh yes, but you may want to stay living in Holland. Whereas for the world super rich, it's easier to move around countries which are English speaking rather than thinking that you might want, if you want to stay in your local community. Another example is New Zealand, just to jump. In New Zealand recently, one of the main newscasters had their salary increased up to, I think it's £250,000 or the equivalent in New Zealand dollars. And there was an outcry across Auckland about this, because it was just seen as a ridiculous amount of money that one person should spend for sitting in front of a camera casting the news. But people knew each other.
But New Zealanders also speak English, so your argument falls down.
No, my arguments aren't all great. but to go back, the English-speaking countries, Canada, the USA, UK, New Zealand is the most equal, and Australia is more unequal. They tend to be more unequal than the rest of the OECD countries that are rich. And the person who made this argument first of all was the author of Affluenza. Anybody remember him?
James.
Oliver James, and the spirit level people hated it. He was doing it mainly about cultural effects, so the effects of movies, the effects of advertising and so on, and just saying that American culture can spread much more easily into English-speaking language countries than it can into countries where you don't. But I'm not very. I should get off this because, but I think it is just worth considering, particularly because this idea about shame. If you can install an idea that certain behaviour is more immoral than other behaviour, it changes hearts and minds. And when I talk to people who remember the 1920s and 30s, they said that the way people fought from the Great Gatsby position of the early 1920s through to mass unemployment in the 30s is it changed how proud you could be of the fact that you were a money maker. Money makers changed from being seen as Darwinian giants in the early 1920s to being a huge part of the problem across the world by the late 1930s. And that sense of shame is one of the ways in which we may see this controlled. If people are no longer proud of simply making money. A comic, an Australian comic, said in 2008, and he called it far too early, but he said making conspicuous wealth is about to go out of fashion, rather like the codpiece went out of fashion in the past. And it was just trying to explain it's possible to have big changes in what we recognise as a great achievement. And you don't have to think back that far. 10 years? To bankers swilling champagne in the City of London?
Still are.
But I'm being happy to be filmed doing it.
Isn't the problem that the super rich actually form an international community?
London, New York, Paris,
Yeah.
you know, Bahrain, wherever
New
the...
Zealand, Scotland.
If you want to come back on that briefly,
Yes, I'd agree. It is a problem, and it makes it possible for that behaviour to continue, and to not see other people as human. The real danger comes when you stop seeing other people as, you know,
It's
as
not
having...
just that, they bought the politicians off. They're the super rich and the multinational elites and bankers and so on have actually bought the political system
They
off.
have, but it isn't as cut and dried as that. For instance, I was asked a couple of years ago to go and talk to some top bankers, and I couldn't work out why on earth they'd asked me to go and speak to them at all, until one of them, the person who invited me, said that his son had just joined Third World First, or whatever it's called, People and Planet it's now called, which is about how the world's going wrong. His son had joined People and Planet and was now no longer talking to his father at Christmas. These bankers are not completely isolated. They will have cousins, children, other people, you know. But if they become completely isolated, if you have a situation like England had with the Raj, where you go out but you don't see the people in India that's like you, and then you go back to the home counties, which is why they're called the home counties, then terrible things can occur. So you want to bring the rich in to wanting to be respected and to be part of society. And they want to be respected. They're always showing you how much money they're giving to charity and how much they get.
Okay, Danny, do you want to jump in at this point?
I do. There's a lot of political points and political questions to answer, but now I just want to stick to the empirical side of things, because I think there's an enormous amount of confusion just on the basic empirical trends. So to give some examples of what I mean, people think about Sweden. They think, oh, Sweden is a really equal society. Well, it is equal in one dimension, relatively equal, or less unequal if you look at Sweden in relation to income. In relation to wealth, in fact, Sweden is very unequal. So why would you say income is important rather than wealth? It's not, you know, it's more complicated on an empirical level than people think. Or Japan. Japan, again, yes, relatively speaking, less unequal than America or Britain. One reason for that, in fact, is that Japan is very, very strict on immigration and allows very few immigrants into the country. If there were more Filipinos and people from Thailand and so on, people from India in Japan, it would probably be a more unequal society, but I would argue actually a better and more diverse society. So these things are not nearly as straightforward as people assume. Or the question also about the stagnant middle is an important question, which I'm not going to try and answer now. But it's related to the inequality discussion. It's a slightly different discussion that average salaries arguably have stagnated. That's a different, although related to, you know, the fact that the gap between rich and poor has become wider. Just finally on the empirical question, to look at the really broad sweep of what's going on, what's happened, just throughout the 20th century and recently. What you had running up to the First World War, broadly speaking, you had an economy, global economy that was becoming more and more stagnant. At the same time as it was becoming more stagnant, you had more financial speculation. These two things were related because rather than investing in the productive economy, there was a lot of investing in shares and bonds and so on, as we've had more recently. And then those relationships with, you know, that was up until 1914 when the First World War broke out. You had widening inequality. Then the broad picture is you had the world economy breaking down. You had the First World War. You had the Great Depression. You had the rise of fascism. You had the Second World War. So these financial connections broke. Inequality narrowed. So in a sense, you might say it's a good thing because inequality is narrowed. But the wars, in fact, the First and Second World War were not coincidental. They were very much part of the story of a global economy fragmenting. So in many ways, problematic, not a straightforward narrative in the way that it's been told. Then you had a period of relative equality, so the 40s, 50s and 60s are a period sometimes called by historians a great compression, because relatively speaking, you had a narrowing of inequality. And in a sense, that period was the unusual period, that you had the narrowing of inequality. And then in the 70s, you can see the trends that you had before the First World War emerging again, where you had a slowing down of the global economy, certainly in the West, the rise of more speculation as productive opportunities became less available. And there you have the emergence of inequality in Western societies. But it's not the top 20%. This is one reason why the spirit level as a political analysis is so shoddy. You know, as far as I remember, the spirit level talks about the top quintile, the top 20% of the income distribution. What is really striking about the last few years is not the top 20%, it's what economists refer to as top inequality, or the 1%, where a relatively small group of people at the very top have done very, very well. And that's not because they've had high salaries, because those people don't get most of their remuneration from salaries. That mainly comes from things like shares, share options, financial markets, those kind of things. So these are the key empirical trends. They're not the most important things, but to really understand what's going on, you've got to get a proper handle on the empirical trends and recognise that they're far more complicated than most people assume. And they don't fit into the neat boxes of inequalities bad here and less inequalities good here. It's a much more complicated narrative on an empirical level, but that has to be separated from the political questions, which are really the important questions. But it doesn't help when all these empirical things are being muddled up all the time, which is what constantly happens in these discussions.
Okay, thank you. Martin?
There's an awful lot of issues in play here. So I'll just say a couple of things, I guess. On the first question about equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity, I mean, that could be a real debate that people had, let's say 20 or 30 years ago, where you might have thought that there was a real choice between them. But in a society that's as inegalitarian as this one, even if all you care about is equality of opportunity, even if you couldn't care less about equality of outcome, if you just want to create the conditions for people having decent opportunities, then that points you towards greater equality of it. So I think there are places, I mean, if we were having this conversation in Sweden, that might look like more of an issue where one had to stake out a particular position. The striking thing about extremely unequal societies like this one is you can get agreement about what you ought to do politically across people that might have quite different views to what kind of equality they care about. Another thing that came out in your question, I think, was what I sometimes think of as kind of inequality cascades. So different kinds of inequality often ramify and kind of create other inequalities and feed off themselves. So the more inequality of economic power you have, the more that you have, let's say, CEOs of large companies getting richer and richer, having more and more economic power, more and more able to kind of capture government to their interest, able then to create systems of regulation and taxation that do less and less to hold back inequality. That in itself creating a situation where there's less and less equality of opportunity, and the cycle kind of bootstrapping its way forward. So I think the dynamics of kind of increasing inequality are very problematic, and it means that there's a lot that you have to do to try to break those cycles. On the question about wealth creation, which I think, there's so much that there's a lot of angles that one could take on that. But I mean, in one way, it connects with what Danny was saying about his bankers that invited him to talk to them. I think it's striking when I think of people I know who work in the city. What they never say to you is this. They never say to you, "We've pulled the wool over your eyes. We've really got away with murder here. We're getting massive, massive rewards, and we don't create any social benefit whatsoever." They never want to say that what they've done is a trick. They always want to justify what they're doing, and they've always got a story about the role that they have within the economy, that, a rising tide lifts all boats. They always want to kind of, I think it's a very deep human need, right, to think that you can justify your position to others. Right? And that it's encouraging, I think, that people are like that. But, so I think that it would be an odd... So the kind of view of inequality that would be unjustifiable would be one that said we had to level down, even in cases where actually an inequality was to everyone's benefit. But so many inequalities aren't actually like that at all. I mean, so if you look at period of you know, the recent crash, there was a 1 year period between 2008 and 2009 where the FTSE went down by 1/3. Right, 1/3 of the value of UK stocks was kind of wiped off the stock exchange. During that point, CEO salaries went up by 10%. Right, so if we had a system that did a good job of kind of tracking rewards to success in wealth creation, well, that would be one thing, and that we could have different arguments about that. But we're not even there. We have a situation where very often we have rewards for failure rather than rewards for success. That's just the deeper thing to say there, is that it's not actually heroic capitalists that are uniquely wealth creators. Wealth creation is a cooperative activity. It's workers at the coalface in the call centre at Tesco's that are creating wealth, as well as the CEO of Tesco's or of any other company. And you know, to think about that, I mean, the idea of Darwinian competition is an interesting one, because we're not in a Darwinian society, and it's a very good job that we're not. And if you want a Darwinian society, try and be a successful banker or CEO in Mogadishu rather than London or Amsterdam or Paris or Berlin. Right, that's what a Darwinian society looks like. And you can't be a heroic capitalist though. Being a heroic capitalist is something that can only be done given a background system of social cooperation, and given the fact that actually you're in an economy where people are getting educated, where there's a health service, where there's infrastructure, right, where there's social trust. And to focus, I think, only on, you know, the guy, and it's often the guy who ends up being at the top of the pyramid in that structure, and to think that everything that flows from that is to do with the agency of that individual, I think fails to kind of see that the story's more complex. So, yeah, so I think that, you know, having said all that, one wouldn't have to think that it was inappropriate to reward fantastic capitalist leaders in order to think that we should have a much more egalitarian society, because as with so many of these things, our society is so far off one side, really, that we could have all that we want in terms of greater opportunities or greater potential for entrepreneurship with a much more egalitarian settlement than we have now. We're not in the zone where those questions really start to pinch.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, okay, more questions and comments. Take 1, 2, then 3, then 4. So, Anne's here.
Yeah, firstly I just wanted to come back to on the issue of things like salaries in you know, high, you know, FTSE 100 companies, etc. The share price is a measure of the perceptual value of that company by other people from outside, essentially, and not of what that company is actually doing, which is an interesting way to kind of view wealth and value of things, which kind of leads me on to something else about equality of opportunity and where you can go. I'll say the first thing and get everyone to hate me first. I was a public school boy, and our careers talks were about going into derivatives and options trading. I don't know what anyone else's career talks were, because I only went to that school at that time. And as this is kind of a very, very strange world, and you can see, well, hang on. But that's kind of, because trading a derivative is quite removed from everyday life, basically. It's not trading shares, it's another level, it's another abstraction level behind that. And I kind of, when I went to university, realised that actually now you're thrown in, and of course this has been the era when you didn't have to pay to go to university. Suddenly you realise that you were in a very, very, very strange place indeed. Now, I don't know what the sort of emerging impacts of university fees are and the differentiation between different institutions, but is there a worry that the kind of element we get now of where kids from quite well-off or privileged backgrounds actually get to see and mix with people who are not, that we're losing that, and then we're losing then that ability for people to relate to each other, and then yes, see poorer people as human, and whether there is still any real way to climb up the social ladder. As I found to my cost, it's very easy to fall down if you become long-term ill, and then, you know, now be in a situation where your weekly income is less than what it costs a week to send you to school.
Okay,
But,
thank you, Andy.
sorry, I rambled. Yeah.
Is it you next, yeah?
Yeah, I've just got a really quick question, which is, you know, if you're in charge, you all seem to say equalities are desirable, or greater equality is desirable. If you're in charge, what policies would you put in place, and perhaps what wouldn't you? You know, that's my question.
Okay, that's good. Yep.
Following on from that, actually, I wanted to ask Daniel what he's suggesting specifically, because you've spoken against state intervention, so therefore policies are perhaps not relevant, if that's the tack that you're taking. We've had a bit of an idea from Danny and Martin about redistribution through taxation, through salaries, and I just want to specifically mention, you've drawn our attention to the top 1% and how much they're earning, and talking against state intervention. So yesterday, the CEO of G4S retired at the age of 54 as a multi-millionaire, money that he made through outsourcing public services, which we pay for through our taxes, which is a government policy to draw back state control of systems like welfare and so on, which is a part of the redistribution of wealth. And so what is actually happening there is that state is pulling back from these systems, and a small number of people are getting very, very rich, while the services are getting worse and worse and worse, because they're being run by people who are profit-driven and don't actually care about the services that are offering. So what are you actually providing us with here? What are you actually suggesting?
Okay. Yep.
Really follows on from that question. I really welcomed the introduction of some empirical data into this, because I actually found much of the discussion that we've had so far that focuses on anecdotes, purporting to tell us something about the motivation behaviour of heroic capitalists, greedy capitalists, whatever. I don't know what they think. I don't know what motivates them. I'm pretty sure that they probably think they're pretty okay guys. And not doing a bad job. They're not necessarily evil. So trying to distill from what we think other people think is not very helpful. And it seems to me that one of the things that we've not really addressed very comprehensively so far, and I don't think I could distinguish between you in terms of what you think at a conceptual level equality is, and I suspect that there's probably n number of different versions of equality in this room. And similarly, I don't think I really know yet, or haven't heard enough about, depending on what you think equality looks like and what a more equal society would look like, how we get there. So what is it that we do? I've heard a lot about what we shouldn't do, but not a lot about what we might do. But certainly I don't think that we should be trying to say, well, because so-and-so behaves in this way, and in private or even in public or in small group, and that therefore we can somehow change society by changing behaviour of those individuals. Doesn't seem to me to be helpful. I'm a fairly unreconstructed Marxist probably, and you know that there's a sort of structural and systemic thing that I would like to kind of get a handle on here, which I don't think I've got yet.
There's some excellent questions. That's great. Cheers for that. Steve?
Just to follow on a little bit from that line you just said there, really. I think, first of all, Daniel's tried to sort of raise the political side of inequality, and I'm afraid, despite our discussion, I think that seems to have been lost. So I suppose it comes down to some extent as to, do we really talk about just the economic side? I think it's difficult to separate the two, but do we just talk about the economic side? And frankly, the two guys on your right, all of it is a moral rant against greedy bankers and the psychology of them. I mean, what on earth that can do to enable us to understand what the hell's going off in society and how we can readjust equality, I have absolutely no idea. I'd also like to question the guys, what do you actually want? You talk about you want more equality. What does that mean? I got a sense from Daniel to start with that he's really wanted to push forward about growth and realising human potential, and perhaps the only way we can do that is by getting abundance, so we're all in a position to decide when is enough. But what do you two guys actually want? More equality if you want. Do you want my income to grow by 10% and to be happy? 15%? 20%? Do you want poverty in Africa to be got rid of? In South America to be got rid of? Do you want standards in the UK to be raised? Can we do this by your redistributionist model? I mean, basically, you seem to be excusing the capitalist system that we live under. You want to moralise about it and just take a little bit of some greedy arseholes in the city and give it to us poor folk a little bit lower down. I'm sorry, but that's just not good enough. What is it that you want?
Cheers, that's Steve. Before we come back to the panel, any more points? Any more questions? Go on.
Yeah, I'm just wondering why it is that Conservatives have embraced the idea of equality. And I'm just thinking there was a traditional Conservative argument was that inequality is the price you pay for prosperity, and that the creation of wealth, although it generates inequalities, actually gives people increases people's standard of living. Why have Conservatives now seem to value inequality as a value in and of itself, separate from prosperity? Because it doesn't seem to be the argument that equality is necessary in order to generate prosperity. And I just wondered why the Conservatives have shifted.
Okay, Daniel, you want to go first?
Yeah, okay, come here. I want to try and answer the questions on this side from the two women and then the guy here. Try to pull them all together as best I can to answer them as succinctly as possible. Talk about state intervention and so on. I think what we have at the moment is what I would characterise as an anxious middle class view. And I'm trying to use that as a descriptive term rather than as throwing out an insult. Because the mindset of contemporary politicians generally, I think, is, oh my God, society's falling apart, isn't it so terrible? We've got the greedy bankers who are doing all these terrible things in the city, and we've got this horrible, horrible underclass of ordinary people who are misbehaving and drinking and shagging and doing all these terrible things. How do we cohere society together? That's what informs the contemporary discussion. So when I was talking about being against state intervention before, I'm not arguing it from a free market point of view that in principle I'm in favour of a minimal state. That's not what I'm arguing. What I'm saying that is, first of all, in relation to ordinary people, the discussion is very much about micromanaging their lives. It's about, trying to push them to drink a certain amount and no more, to practice safe sex, don't have teenage pregnancies, to have all of these government and state interventions to control how people live. So I was objecting to the micromanagement of individual lives of what you want to call working class people, if you want to use the old terminology. I'm very much against that. And that's one reason I think the equality and freedom discussion are very much related, because I think this technocratic conception of inequality and dealing with inequality does lead to restrictions, very tight restrictions on people's freedom. However, I think this middle class view also is about restraining in bankers and the greedy CEOs and so on. I think that's also problematic, not because I love bankers or CEOs or anything like that, but what it's really about is saying, well, society is out of control. Let's hold things back. Let's hold back growth for the sake of the environment. We need to make things sustainable. We need to stop growth getting out of control. And it's very, very negative about economic growth as well. I mean, Spirit Level, for example, it says very clearly, they think economic growth has pretty much run its course, certainly in the West. I think that's problematic as well, because what I'm arguing for is to carry on to have a much more affluent society. I don't think it'll necessarily come from entrepreneurship, but we need a much more affluent society so that scarcity is no longer a problem. So it's in that sense that I'm an egalitarian. Ferrari's for all, in a sense, is egalitarian because it's for all, for everyone, but it's Ferrari's because I think we can do a lot more better economically. We need to have policy directed very much towards economic growth, Because if we have a much larger pie, then I think everyone can do better. So I'm not going to spell out practical policies. You can come back, you can ask questions. Let me just finish my point, and you can come back and ask questions. I'm happy to answer them. So I'm not going to spell out detailed policies, but what I think is we need more growth, and we need to respect people's freedoms and their moral autonomy, and equality, to the extent we believe in equality, it has to be part of that package, not a package of minimising inequality and controlling how people run their lives and holding back economic growth, which essentially is the middle class consensus that we have at the moment.
Okay, I'll begin. Yeah, go on, Danny. You want to go now?
Okay, I'll try and answer your question as well. What I want is pretty timid, which is partly the reason why I don't spell it out very much. And it may be pretty middle class, but it's middle class of this age rather than middle class of the last time we were this unequal. When we were last this unequal, which is in the 20s and 30s, we just didn't have enough to go round. We now actually have enough to go round. What I want in a more equal society is a better use of what we have. My great fear is we'll do things like build 1 million extra houses in 5 or 6 years, but find that we share them out even worse than we have already. My fear is that we won't recognise that we are unlikely to carry on becoming richer. That may well have run its course for Great Britain. But we actually have enough of things that if we just shared it out a bit better, we could do better. And it's very mundane. So it's things like, I would like to get back to a situation where the vast majority of children feel happy going to their local school, so that their journey to school is short and their parents are not carrying them to school and back. These things make sense for all kinds of reasons and make everybody happier, not least they can play with the children on their street because they know who those children are. It's a series of pretty mundane things. What I would do and what I wouldn't do. The kind of thing I would think about doing for housing is a land value tax. There are some kinds of taxes, and particularly taxes on wealth, that I think are worth doing. All the super rich who bought property in London, you can get some of that money from them by taxing the value of the land that they own, and most people will be far better off because their land, if they have any, isn't worth very much. The kind of things I wouldn't do, which often annoy my more left-wing friends, I wouldn't try to tackle, for instance, our private school system, even though it's the most extreme private school system in the rich world. 25% of all our secondary spending goes on just 7% of kids. I'm in favour of trying to leave things pretty free if you can leave them free. But my great worry is that we are simply consuming more and more, but in a way that's making us less happy because we're consuming it less efficiently. So greater equality could mean that what we've got, which was unlikely to get much bigger in a world that's sustainable, will be used far better. And most people's lives, the vast majority of people's lives, possibly even including quite a lot in the top 10 and 1%, would be improved. The last thing I do want to say, there is huge inequality within the top 10 and 1%. We have thousands of statistics if you want them, but it really does bore you rigid if I start reading them out. You're right that the bulk of the money of the top 1% is interest and so on from wealth. But most people in the top 1% aren't receiving most of their money from that. A general practitioner is just in the top 1%. And most of the income of a general practitioner, of your doctor, is not their stocks and shares, it's actually their salary. So the bottom half of the top 1% feel themselves quite hard done by. And unless you begin to understand that and see things from the point of view of people up and down the income scale, you're not going to understand why people behave like they do. Because as far as most people are concerned, they are in the middle, and the people above them have too much, and they're quite frightened of falling down to the group below them. And that's the same all the way up and down the scale.
Okay, thank you. Martin?
So, like Danny, I thought it was a good thing not to have a barrage of statistics, and I thought it's no harm to talk about moral values, not least because one thing that's gone wrong, I think, with a lot of our discourse about the economy is that we've kind of evacuated our moral values from that, and we've kind of moved away from just appealing to what are just fairly minimal, widely shared beliefs about what makes for a better society. What I'd want to resist, though, is the thought that if you do that, you're not taking structures seriously. You can do both, right? You can think that there's a moral problem of inequality, and you can think that the way of addressing that is then to change how the economy is organised, to change how corporate governance works, to change how the taxation of corporations works, to move taxation away from VAT and income taxation and more towards forms of capital taxation, to have a land value tax. There are lots of things you can do that are structural changes to how the state relates to the economy that then will produce an outcome that you might want to assess as morally better or worse. So I think if we're serious about trying to think through these issues, I think we absolutely have to do both, right? We have to think about what kinds of structural changes would have the right kinds of effects, but we've also not got to kind of shy away from kind of thinking in moral terms. So to disagree with the man at the back who accused me of a mere moral rant about greedy bankers, I mean, if anything, I was being nice about bankers, right? I was saying that even with the greedy bankers, there's still people like that still see themselves very often as kind of providing some sort of social good. But what I'm absolutely not saying, what would be a bad kind of moralism, I think, would be to say, well, all of the problem is just about people's motivations, and therefore if we want a more just society or a more equal society, what we've got to do is change, somehow kind of make bankers more generous or expect people to... We don't know how to do that. We do know what it would be to change the tax structure or to change the way that corporations are regulated or whatever else. So just on the very specific question of, what would this mean in terms of policies? I think, like Danny, I'm very timid as well. So I guess there's two questions. One question is sort of, what would you do in very close to current circumstances? And then there's another question about what you might want to do that's more aspirational. I think when there's real suffering under current conditions, where people who are, this chap here was saying, the level of street homelessness is going up, where the income distribution is such that those at the very bottom have real kind of tangible, terrible levels of deprivation, then what you shouldn't be doing is stopping the uprating of benefits. And if you need to pay for that by taxing those at the top more, well, that's something that we ought to do because it's a morally urgent requirement that we try and avoid all kinds of suffering. I think in the longer run, what we need to do is just think about how government can help to create an economy that at whatever level of growth shares the proceeds of that growth more equitably among the people who collectively produce it. Now, what that means is taxing corporations much better. It means taxing real corporate activity rather than paper entities that can be paying royalties to subsidiaries in Ireland or the Netherlands or whatever else. It means thinking about things like land value taxation. If that's what if the only way that we can kind of have forms of taxation is to go to tangible, unmovable features of the world, well, okay, something like land value tax is a good way to do it. And it also, and this connects in with Daniel's points about potential, it means the state having a role, I think, in trying to let the wellsprings of individual potential be realised. And that connects with kind of hoping for a more entrepreneurial economy in the future. Now, and I think the kinds of things that you could do in order to realise that are things that aren't terribly radical, but that one sees in some of our European neighbours, like the Scandinavian countries, where there's a lot more support for parents, right? Where there's a lot more, where the state does more to kind of fund childcare, which in itself lets parents kind of engage more in economic activity and also helps the most deprived members of society to have a better start in life. So, I mean, I think the things that we could do aren't sort of unrealisable, kind of highly abstract goals. They're just the kinds of things that many of our neighbouring European countries do already. And it's just to kind of move back from the extreme kind of crushing of potential that you get in a highly inegalitarian society like this, where actually there's just not the right kind of there's not the right sort of balance between who benefits from the economy and who doesn't. So,
Right, this will be the penultimate round of questions. So I'll take 1, 2, 3, 4.
Well, my concern is the moral discourse being framed mostly in terms of economics. To me, it's esoteric. I don't understand it, and I'm quite sure a lot of the electorate don't understand it. Now, I can understand a bit about the finances going to single parents, and when we talk about how it affects individual people. And I can understand the demonisation of benefit claimants, and I can understand why the Tories are arguing for equality, because it gets extra votes. But when it comes to terms of economics, I just don't understand the language, so I can't understand the moral discourse, and I don't understand how it works in a way that's going to achieve the outcomes in the first place. So I think I'm quite sure I'm not the only person in the country who doesn't understand the economics, and I'm quite sure there's a hell of a lot of people who don't understand, even economists who don't understand the crash. Now, where is this disparity between the moral discourse, which I think we've lost sight of, which is shared entirely by economists and people who understand the economy, and the discourse? Well, I don't think there is a moral discourse, a common moral discourse of equality anymore in the country. I think it's a very selfish, almost a possessive individualism forced upon us by Thatcherism, I'm afraid.
Steve?
Thanks for giving me a quick chance to reply. I will be as quick as I can, so I've had 2 bites to it now. Martin really disappointed, it's just been morality. Danny, thank you for your honesty. I'm surprised that in your words you've said it. You want very little and we've got enough. And what we've got, you just want to redistribute. I thank you for your honesty, and that really is the crux of what this is about. Because the woman in the middle, when you said it, when Danny replied, shouted, "We have enough." Well, I'm sorry, we've no way bloody well got anywhere near what we want, can demand, and what we need for my generation, my kids and my grandkids that are born, and for generations to come. I brought my kids up to believe that it's a tough world out there, but it's our world to take. I don't accept, because the question that will come back is, we're running out of resources. Well, we've been running out for 300 years, and we stand on the shoulders of generations that's got us to where we are now, that had no limits, and there should be no limits henceforth. And I think it's absolutely brilliant that Danny has really got to the crux of this. He's admitted where he's coming from and what it's about. And I think what we need really now is to take society forward and use what we have in society. The best and most beautiful things we've got in society is 7 billion people now, billions more to come, more resources we've got, we're still finding day by day, and there's more to come. We don't even know what they are, we don't know how we can act on them and make them better. That's what we need, and I hope that Daniel in his summing up will give us a better view of what I can espouse, but I've tried the best. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
I'm not going to follow that. I suppose one of the things I'm a little bit disappointed at is that this discussion is, and I don't know if it's the same question as yours, but very much seems to be focused on this notion about creating economic wealth, and that realising individuals' potential is all about creating economic wealth, rather than thinking there's lots of different potential and wealth in society that we create. Ferraris for all just seems puerile in that way. Sorry. But, you know, they say, what do you mean by Ferraris for all? So when are we going to stop producing Ferraris? Do we want a new Ferrari every year because that one's now out of date? And I wonder whether the moral discussion about what we mean by wealth and wealthy society and harnessing people's wealth is far too narrow on creating consumer and creating things, and rather than thinking about ways that we can maximise human potential to make life better for everybody.
Yeah. Okay. There was another hand. I can't remember where it was. Yeah.
I want to sort of refer to the start, basically when you were sort of summarising and saying that everyone's born equal, that the quote from that. And the thing is, I think you contradicted yourself straight away and said, well, actually, no, you accepted that actually if you're from Eton, then you might have more opportunities or more opportunities coming your way. Now, I worked for 3 years in Bradford with Youth Offenders, which is a very down and out deprived city. There's a real, quite sad lack of opportunity there. The kids there, the only opportunity they had, and some of those were very intelligent, which the right wing would often not accept. They were very intelligent, they knew what they were doing, they were taking their best opportunity, which was often crime. And that they knew exactly what they were doing. That was all they had. The only other possible opportunity they had was to go to the army and die in our wars. And they were, I feel there's a bit immoral with that when you're preying on kids that age. So basically what I want to go back to the point is how, without state intervention, do you think you are going to give people that have possibly their dad's in jail, their mum's perhaps a drug abuser, how are you going to give them the same opportunity and say they're born equal when they have so different opportunities at the start of life without state intervention? I think that is completely impossible, and if you carry along that line, you're going to end up with further societies that get further apart, more crime, more no connection. You can argue that all you like and you can go, but it's going to end up more dispersed, and it's not going to be a good thing for society, and I'd like you to try to defend that argument.
Okay, cheers for that question. I'll come back, I'll start with Daniel first, because the last question ended with Daniel. If you can make this kind of really maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and each of you 2 or 3 minutes, I'll go back out for one more round of questions, and then it'll be a chance for a final summing up. So if you can kind of come back very briefly on some of these points.
Well, on the final point, I think you misunderstood or misremember what I said, because I said at the very beginning, society is definitely unequal. We all agree on that. And also that people do have better life chances if they go to Eton or whatever. So I don't think there's any contradiction in that. Although I do think people do have moral choices. I think even if you come from a really poor, deprived background, you might be pushed in particular directions, but you still can make moral choices. I wouldn't say those people have no capacity to make moral choices. Just very briefly on the economics thing, I mean, it's not true that there's this thriving economics discussion and not much of a moral political discussion. The economics discussion is rubbish as well, I can assure you, and I follow it very closely. But very, very briefly, what I would argue is that a precondition for realising the full human potential is to abolish scarcity. So economics is not everything, but until we abolish scarcity, we won't be truly free, we won't be truly able to do what we want to do, because we'll be constrained by the limits of resources in society. So we need to push to produce more and more until we reach a point where scarcity is no longer a problem.
Okay, I'll come to Martin first and then to Daniel. Briefly come back on 2 points.
I thought that the point about the sort of esotericism of the economics discussion is a great one. I don't know exactly what we should be doing about that. There's a lovely bit in John Lanchester's book on the crash, which has got the wonderful title "Whoops," which tells you something about what happened. So Lanchester says, think about when people grew up in the Soviet Union. They were marshalled at school in how the system worked, what all the institutions were of the system, and they grew up, even though the system didn't work, people at least knew how it was meant to work and what the moving parts were. Whereas we have a very odd political debate where, as you say, it's always in economic terms, and it relies upon kind of often specialist knowledge that isn't communicated terribly well in school to people. And it's interesting to think what to do about that. I mean, it might point towards just having trying to do more with the education system to give people a bit more sort of literacy in how the regime that they live under works. I don't want to take too long, so just one overarching point that connects with things that a few people have said about growth and inequality. I think it's implausible to think that there are no environmental limits to growth. And if we think that we don't have to care about inequality, because we can have a kind of, the sort of superabundance that Marx thought that we could have, I think that just doesn't take seriously the fact that we live in a world of finite resources. Now that doesn't say that we need no growth, but I think thinking that there are some environmental limits to growth is not something that we can get away from. And once there are limits, then thinking about equality matters. Of course, even if you could have Ferraris for all, you can't have political power for all. You can't have, so many goods are positional, right? We could all have a Ferrari, but we can't all have more influence than others. We can't all have the house on the hill rather than the house at the bottom of the hill. We can't all have an equal level of positional goods, right? So even if you could have a sort of a distribution of material goods that was so abundant that distributional questions seem to drop out, that's not true of a lot of other kinds of goods, like power, whether it's economic power or political power. Another background assumption here is that there's some sort of very straightforward trade-off between equality and growth. That's not the case, right? I mean, so in the post-war periods, we had higher levels of equality and we had sustained high levels of growth. Recently, during the last 30 years, we've had much lower levels of growth, much higher levels of inequality. At the moment, Britain has higher levels of inequality and lower levels of growth than many of our European neighbours. So it's not that there's a very straightforward trade-off here. I mean, I agree more with the thing Daniel said earlier, that the empirical questions are complicated.
Okay. Danny?
The latest question about the wider benefits of a more equal society other than purely economic, and why you'd want equality other than economic. There are so many reasons. There's really practical things. If we gave you all a Ferrari, we couldn't build enough roads to be able to get you all into Leeds without sitting in traffic jams. Buses work better. They've tried it in America. In America, they have more people sitting in traffic jams for longer. People do different jobs in more equal societies. In Britain, we've got 1 in 10 people working in retail. And a large amount of working in retail involves the equivalent of standing in a shop, when people come in to look at clothes, asking if you can help them, to try to persuade them to buy something they don't actually want. Now that isn't a very fulfilling life, for fulfilling your potential, trying to encourage people to buy things they didn't necessarily think they wanted. So you get it home and you think, I didn't want that, but you leave your job at the end of the day thinking, what did I achieve today? I sold another 5 pair of jeans than I would have if I hadn't tried hard enough. In more equal societies, people end up doing things which I think are more socially useful. And this extends across society. So as you said about what your career advice was in your school, for a lot of my life, I've taught university students in quite posh universities, who when I've said to them, what are you going to go on to do? Well, I teach geography, so you know what the most common thing for a geographer to do? Accountancy. They want to be an accountant or a lawyer or another job that will quickly get them £50,000 or £60,000. Now, they might get the money, but to spend, it's half my working life now, teaching young people who see that they have to do a job that they're not that interested in. That's the kind of society you don't want. Lastly, the man at the back. Your children and your grandchildren can have all these things. They can have a wonderful life, they can have a huge amount of stuff. It's just that lots more of it's going to have to be weightless. It's going to be stuff that they get digitally. It won't be material, but it doesn't mean that they won't be very, very happy. We're heading towards 10 billion people on the planet. It's absolutely fine. It's not a problem. They can have more, we can have massive growth, it just must be, more and more of that growth must be stuff that doesn't actually exist materially, because we haven't got enough place to put it in. Over scarcity, we have reached a point when my middle class mum was growing up in Gipton, even though she was the daughter of a school teacher, she can remember the ice on the insides of the windows in the 1950s. There was a time when we didn't have enough, and your argument would have worked absolutely then, because we needed more. Now there is no need for people to go cold in this country, given the amount of gas and oil that we're bringing in. It's just that we distribute things so uneasily that some people can afford to have the windows open, heating their houses enormously, and usually other people can't afford it. And so we've got to that point where materially we have enough, we can expand more in the future, but we cannot expect to be able to win some global race will we carry on getting more and more and more than everybody else on the planet.
Okay, right, final questions and comments, and then I'll bring our speakers back in reverse order to come back on some of them and do their final summing up. So, Graham?
Yes, I'm glad we made at least a short foray into the world of morality and the political conceptualisations of equality, because perhaps that's the underexplored arena. And I think about something that I've learned tonight, which is about perhaps what you might call the lack of proximity between different kinds of people. You talked about bankers not understanding the poor. You talked about the value of the university as being a place where you can get in contact with other ideas, to recognise and understand their humanities. The arts has that function, and that's under attack also. So what kind of proximity models might we employ? Perhaps it's something to do with participative democracies, where the different stakeholders can sit and argue and talk about their different social realities. But it's perhaps more importantly the concept of the social in the first place. You know, when we talk economically, when we talk about potential, it's almost entirely about that of the individual. And with the social, we get the moral, and we get the ethical, and of course we get a paradigm for politics as well. And I'd like to see, you know, a proximity-based model of politics where ordinary people can participate in the making of decisions and then hear those other voices. And I think we'd all be better off for that.
Okay. And I forgot to say, can you make it reasonably brief as well, questions and comments? So anything more?
It seems to me that even in a meritocracy, individuals who are successful tend to think that they merit or deserve their success and the rewards that it brings. Isn't it time we had a more scientific view of what it is that makes human beings the way they are? And I'm thinking of a determinist model in which we're the product of our genes and our environment in the broadest sense from the moment of conception on. So we can't really claim to deserve or merit what we achieve or the rewards that it brings.
Okay. Mark?
Yeah. In all those societies which haven't managed to achieve growth, equality has basically become rationing out misery. It's been rationing scarcity of resources. One example of this is China, where before the recent period of growth, they actually rationed the amount of children you could have to one child per family. Luckily, China's now embraced growth, it's grown massively, and that policy is gone. But I think there are dangers when you have equality without growth, very severe dangers to our liberties. And I think that's something we haven't really sort of discussed tonight. I just wondered if the panelists would comment on that.
Okay. Well.
Yeah, we were thinking, well, should we be talking about the difference between what people need and what people want? And for example, yeah, just the thought of Ferraris for all makes me think, well, actually, isn't a Ferrari a positional good? And if everyone had a Ferrari, then nobody would want one. But actually, you know, the idea of, you know, should we be starting with things like making sure that nobody goes hungry and nobody's in a house with ice on the inside of the windows in winter, which presumably don't actually require society to be considerably more equal?
Okay. Right. Okay. If there's no more questions, we'll round off. You've only got really 2, maximum 3 minutes each. So starting with Martin, it's going to have to be brief.
There's a wonderful thing that Bill Gates said about deserving economic rewards for your talent, where Bill Gates said his talent would have been economically worthless for most of human history. Being a sort of severely short-sighted, geeky chap who was very good at symbolic manipulation or programming wouldn't have been very good in the Middle Ages, let alone in a hunter-gatherer society. So even if you thought that your own talents and abilities were robustly yours in a sense that was very morally significant, and if you rejected even the kind of deterministic picture that you mentioned, you might still realise that actually the fact that your talents are productive, the fact that they can deliver certain kinds of benefits, back to you, that depends on social context, and that depends on our collective life and having society and having a society and an economy as a collective project, and it does depend on others, and that should go into how we think about the rewards that people get. I think the point about long run and short run goals is very important. I think that socioeconomic equality is a very important value, but it's not as important as just avoiding terrible forms of human suffering that we don't have to put up with. And I think when one thinks about immediate policy, the way that austerity has hit the worst off in our society, we don't have to think about abstract values or even non-abstract values of equality to think about what to do there. We just have to think about what we can do to make sure that we get rid of levels of avoidable suffering. In the longer run, I think we need to think about what kind of institutions we'd want to have a more egalitarian society. I'll finish with just this one point. So to pick up on the point about it not all being about the economy and about human potential being in the social domain as well, and about not just being about paid work. If you're to ask me what kind of policies I'd like to have 30 or 40 years from now rather than immediately, I think trying to have a sharing out of time and power over people's time that was more equitable would be worth having, and therefore having a society in which everyone had an income that wasn't dependent on work would be good. So some kind of basic income entitlement, some kind of, as it were, citizen income that we all had, where we shared some of the benefits of, right? That would be a good policy to have within an egalitarian society. But I'm not so naive as to think that that isn't a long way off. So.
Okay, thank you. And Danny?
Levels of inequality tend to change slowly. So I'm afraid that the kind of bad news is that even if we were to become more equal, we are very likely to become more equal very slowly, and we'll probably carry on being angry about it for most of the rest of our lives. But being angry about it is necessary. I was in Oslo a year or so ago, and I stupidly started my talk by saying, congratulations on having the lowest rate of child poverty in the world, to which the audience reacted, it's too high, it's terrible, but you know what things are. And that's why the Norwegians have the lowest rate of child poverty in the world, because they're angry about it. You get an opposite effect in unequal countries. If you ask people a question about, say, how clever they are or how good a driver they are, you tend to find in the more unequal country you ask it, the higher proportion of people think they're really good. And our thinking is actually changed by the nature of society we're in. So I'm afraid the bad news, mine and yours, it's harder for us to think clearly in a very unequal society. Our very thinking becomes corrupted. You look at the United States of America and the kind of things people say there about socialised healthcare, for instance, to get an example of how thinking becomes corrupted as inequalities get even bigger. And then think about, what does somebody in Oslo think about us if they're sitting quietly in the room here, and what on earth we're talking about. And lastly, you've talked about citizen income and so on, that would be great in the future. My kind of one policy thing would be an immediate thing on what we can do. The last time inequalities were as big as they were now in the 1930s was the last time we had soup kitchens. We managed to get rid of soup kitchens all the way through until the food banks came in a couple of years ago again. That's what you get when you have gross inequalities, those kinds of things. I would like an incoming government in 2015, regardless of anything else and regardless of how bad the financial situation may be, to say we shall ensure that nobody will starve, we shall ensure that you are housed, we shall ensure that you don't become so cold that you become ill. Some basic guarantees for the short term I think will be needed. I don't see why political parties do not think, because the cost is relatively small of providing those basic guarantees, but it does require you to think that everybody deserves at least that, which requires you to think of everybody as being more human than we currently think, because we treat them as if they're not human if they're at the bottom.
Okay, thank you. And Daniel?
Well, the one thing I strongly agree with Danny and Martin on is what they are suggesting is very modest. Because, you know, despite the fact they kind of picked up on the rhetoric of potential, what they're really talking about is, you know, site redistribution, bit of a safety net, some regulation of the city maybe. And really, it does amount to just sharing out the misery, as someone suggested. It's a very, very kind of limited programme. Although they would no doubt dissociate themselves from the kind of authoritarian side of this. I'm not suggesting bad faith in their part at all. I'm sure they don't identify with it. But that is very much the thrust of this preoccupation with inequality in society from the Conservatives, New Labour, a very authoritarian party as well. That's very much the thrust of what is going on. So I would disagree with them on those grounds. As far as what I'm saying, I mean, I'm very, very strongly against the deterministic view that was put forward at the back, because I think we do really have the capacity to shape our lives for the better. I don't think it's true that there are limited resources, scarce resources. I think that's a myth. I don't think it's true that we're constrained by environmental limits, because although there are challenges, as human beings we have the capacity to overcome those challenges. We do have the capacity, not from bureaucrats above, but from us as individuals and together, we do have the capacity to have a freer society, have a more prosperous society, and in that respect have a more equal society. But if you want to, I know a lot of the arguments I've just put forward are quite counterintuitive, but we have had a discussion on this before, and you can read my book, For All is For All, where I do flesh out those arguments, and so I'll end with a plug for the book. So get For All is For All.
Okay, well, thank you to Danny and Martin.